Živijo vsem, lepo da ste prišli. Danes začenjamo z seminarjem, z jesenskim delom seminarja Maskinih sodobnih scenskih umetnosti. Trajalo bo to nekako celo jesen, september, oktober. Danes je z nami Matt Colquhoun. Have you pronounced it correctly?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
That's the first, actually. Well done.
First one?
Yeah.
I'm prepared, no? I'm prepared. Okay, po Mattu bo predaval še Lea Kuhar, Ana Riberc, Vesna Popežin-Rož, Marek Hrvatin, Maša Radibuh, Jako Pribič. Potem imel še special event, ki bo na muziko centriran. Govorili bomo Ani Sinanović, Jaša Božinel, Robert Bobnič, pa DJ bo Drone Moji. Tako da to nekako je v planu zdaj september, oktober, tako da to je ta del semestra, potem prije pa kasneje še spomladanski del, pride ta Martina Ruzam pa Ben Woodward. Imamo še gledališki seminar in krožek seminarje. Tako skratka, vse to se zdaj dogaja. Tam smo pa ta Fisherjevski del, ki ga bo otvoril Matt. Matt je v bistvu avtor knjige o Mattu Fisherju, o Marka Fisherju. Naslov je Igres, on Melancholy Morning and Mark Fisher. Okay. Je tudi uredil posthumno izdano knjigo Marka Fisherja Post-Capitalist Desire, ki mislim, da je nabor Fisherjevih predavanj oziroma transkripcij. To je pač uredil Matt. Tako skratka, jaz bi v bistvu kar... pa še avtor bloga Zenagotih. Tako da imamo tudi tukaj neko bližino z Markom Fisherjem, skratka, nekako zelo sorodna misel. Tako da v bistvu sem Matta prosil, da danes pravzaprav predaval o tem, o kapitalističnem realizmu, ki smo ga pri Maski izdali par mesecev nazaj. Tako, kaj se je z Markom Fisherjem še vse dogajalo. Gledam to, da je izdal še par knjig potem, da je uredil tudi Mark Fisher in da je Matt izdal še pač to Post-Capitalist Desire. Skratka, kaj vse se je dogajalo, kakšni razvoji so tukaj še sodim v Markovi, v Fisherjevi misli, tako da Matt, just give me a second.
You'll need my finger.
I'll need your finger, Gregor.
I'm so sorry, Matt. This it's just that our well, it doesn't work.
Oh, I see.
We'll just have to do it a little bit improvised.
By the way, drugače programov na teh zložajkah, ne vem, če ste videli, mislim, da je tam po vratih. Tako da vzamete si to, imamo QR kodice in vse to tam še malo. Imamo še knjige, ja, jaz vedno pozamem po te stvari. Skratka, imamo še pa kapitalistični realizem tam, če ga hoče kupiti. So I think that's everything. I forgotten something? No? Okay, and almost free beer. It's almost free, so you have to pay something, as you wish, I guess. But yeah, we have a refrigerator in the back, there's beer, and Matt, off you go.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thank you for the introduction. I have no idea what you said, but I appreciate it. And I appreciate you all coming out tonight and listening to, I'm a fatally Englishman who, you know, I appreciate coming to another country and speaking English. It feels very strange, but anyway, yeah, thank you for being here. I want to excuse my appearance. I just had a shower when I got here. I've had the worst day ever. I missed my connecting flight, so I've been in and out of airports and planes for about 20 hours. Should be a 4-hour flight. So if I'm a little scattered, a little fried, apologies and please bear with me. Yeah, I'm really, really excited to be here. It's my first time in Ljubljana. It's a city I've always wanted to come to, and it's also my first time speaking in public since the coronavirus pandemic. So for that reason and more, it feels like a really special occasion, and it's an honour to spend it with you. That's a coffee fart, I think, just gone out of my head. We're here to talk about Marka Fisher and Marka Fisher's book, Capitalist Realism, which, as you all know, is recently translated into sodobnih. And I guess the book was first published in 2009, and it's strange to think how to approach a 10-year-old book that's nonetheless entering a new context. And in planning the talk tonight, I kind of struggled with how best to approach these kind of overlapping circumstances. And I kind of wondered if it would be more productive to sort of present you with the problem that I've had in trying to address this, and see if that doesn't generate some discussion. On the one hand, I've been told by Alex that the scene here in Ljubljana is already familiar with a lot of Marx's theoretical reference points. Badiou, Jameson, and of course Zizek. And so rather than bore you with more of that, I thought it would be better to maybe talk about the specific UK context that the book emerged from. If only because I assume that maybe people will be less familiar with that. But actually those two things are quite difficult to disentangle from each other. Quite recently I've been doing a lot of research into the influence of Badiou's thought on Mark, which is rarely discussed back home. When Mark was writing this book, a lot of Badiou and Zizek was recently being translated into English. So in that context, a lot of that thought is still quite fresh. But I guess that doesn't necessarily mean that Mark's book is Badiouian, whatever that means. I mean, I'm loading a questionnaire assuming familiarity, but I guess that's part of the problem. This is interesting to note, I think, because at that time in the mid-2000s, a lot of Marx's peers, people like Alberto Toscano, Ray Brassier, Nina Power, were translating a lot of this work for the first time into English. And a lot of that is in the background of this book, but Mark wasn't writing a book for jaded philosophers. He was writing a book for his students at that time. And in 2009, Mark was teaching at a further education college, which is basically 16 to 18-year-olds before they go to university. Mark wanted to write a book that was political, philosophical, but for an audience that wasn't necessarily politically minded or philosophically minded, which makes it kind of a strange book. The problems just kind of keep piling up here, really. And I guess the question becomes, why did Mark choose to write this book at that moment? And 2009, I suppose, is globally speaking, people will associate that with, this book came out the year after the financial crash. And also, I suppose, it's dealing with that phrase that's kind of thrown around so much, which is the end of history, which I suppose is the ultimate victory of global capital in establishing an ideological hegemony. But another way of discussing what the end of history is I guess that you could say that Mark's book is essentially a book about stasis, not just as some like naturally occurring point of equilibrium where sort of moving objects come to rest, but as a political choice and as an orchestrated illusion. Capitalism's ideological consistency depends on its appearing to be the former rather than the latter. That capitalism is realistic means that capitalism is common sense, it's natural, its reasons for existing are pre-established. Presented with the problem of how to organise a society, we're told that capitalism just works, because it is, for better or worse, perfectly attuned to human nature. And yet, whilst capitalism makes the case for its own stability, it sacrifices the idea that improvements can still be made. In this sense, stasis becomes a byword for peace. But our current system affords little questioning of the kind of peace we've come to accept. In fact, it actively smothers any opportunity to think differently. And that's an argument, that's an old argument, really. What we're essentially talking about when we talk about that kind of stasis is ideology. What's interesting about ideology as a concept is that it's not very stable, it has a complicated history. We can consider that ideology was originally a liberal concept coined after the French Revolution to describe liberalism's appeal to the so-called science of ideas, which described a sort of loaded framework, quite similar to what we might now call the marketplace of ideas. A set framework within which ideas can be debated and challenged, but without the underlying, explicitly capitalist foundation being challenged itself. So how we come to think, how can we think outside of capitalism's market dynamics if thought itself is understood according to those same dynamics? And that point too is a few hundred years old. But ideology, I think even Napoleon used the word ideology as an insult to describe liberals who were high on their own reasoning. And then in the 19th century, Karl Marx redefines it explicitly to refer to as a narrative or set of ideas used by the bourgeoisie within a capitalist society to legitimize its own dominance. Then over the course of the 20th century, our understanding of ideology becomes more generalized, it's given many more definitions, but it's still always used to refer to liberalism and capitalist society. And then at some point, the concepts generalize even further. And I think it's since become an insult detached from any initial critique. To say that someone is ideological is to sort of insult anyone with an identifiable set of political convictions. If I think about when I hear the word ideology now, it's usually after some sort of terrorist attack. As if to say that all ideology is itself violent, militant, extreme. And in that sense, it almost as if to say that if you are ideological, it's like another word for pathological. So ideology is detached from any social critique and repurposed by neoliberalism to mean any set of militant ideals whatsoever. But then when we transform ideology into a kind of mental illness, something that's relevant to all of us, because relevant to us all, but it becomes something to deny outright. So in the process, ideology disappears altogether. And it's this disappearance of ideology as such that Fisher was interested in when he wrote Capitalist Realism. And talking about a specifically UK context, this was something that was happening quite explicitly within UK politics at that time. You go back to the mid-1990s, you have Tony Blair's Labour Party, revamped under the unimaginative name New Labour, which decided to erase any explicit appeal to the politics of socialism from the party's constitution, instead positioning the Labour movement as a call for capitalist reform rather than socialist abolition. Though it made appeals to removing ideology from Labour's founding document, it also made a classical liberal understanding of ideology the new foundation of UK politics, an unspoken foundation. And then from that time onwards to the 2000s, when Marx starts writing this, that process becomes really generalized to the point where you have, previously, throughout the 70s and 80s, you have UK society is understood in essentially Marxist terms, as class war, as a conflict between the working and upper classes, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. But then in the late 90s, Tony Blair's Deputy Prime Minister, John Prescott, announced that now actually everybody's middle class. And so soon enough, all political and sociological understandings of the national consciousness were dragged into the impotent centre. That's kind of where I started in thinking how to introduce this book to you tonight. But then I started to think, is this something that anybody here would really care about? There might be some nerds amongst you that really care about the fine details of UK politics, but I imagine that's probably not so much the case. And actually, when you think about it, to talk about this book emerging from that process where the Labour Party is rewriting its constitution, to talk about that in Slovenia especially, seems quite mute when at the same time you have Slovenia rewriting its national constitution. And so my concern almost in coming to Slovenia to talk about this book is that what Mark's trying to set out here for a UK audience is kind of a process that's kind of happened behind closed doors. Whereas, and I mean I might start to show my ignorance here, but this seems like a similar process happened in Slovenia that was in a far more radical and explicit way. And so I got to this point in the talk and I realised, is my explanation of what Fisher's doing, is this going to come across as patronising? When I'm sure that actually the context that Mark's talking to, what he's trying to illuminate, doesn't necessarily require the same amount of illumination here. And if that's the case, then I wonder what the reception of this book will be here now, and even what the point of it is. But actually, I think that Mark's book and the reason why he wrote it still has a lot to say. So I'm going to try and walk that tightrope regardless, which is made even harder by a distinct lack of sleep. But I guess that, what else was my track of my thought? Rather than, and this is, I guess, this is to say that what might be painfully obvious here is also actually something that's painfully obvious in the UK now. To say that Mark wrote this book for people that were 16 to 18 years old in 2009, that was me, I was 16 in 2009. You get 16 to 18-year-olds reading this book now, and they think, well, what's so important about this book? This is all somewhat obvious, isn't it? That our sense of our political development, our political consciousness, has changed since then. But that in itself kind of brings to the fore part of what was at issue in the 2000s. How do you create the new? How do you create new ideas? How do you let new ideas catch on? And what if those ideas aren't actually that new? Does that mean we should care less about them? What's actually happening there? And there's this strange that this, I think, is part of the famous line from this book on the very first page, is that Mark argues that the end of the world is easier to imagine than the end of capitalism. I think part of what's at stake in that question is that when we imagine a new world, a new politics, a new society, we imagine it to be absolutely new. We can't imagine something, or we struggle to imagine something that emerges from where we are now, because where we are now seems quite dire, maybe. But the necessity of asking these questions is rather than producing the absolutely new, it's to start from where we are and expand our horizons beyond, I guess, at that time. And I guess this is, again, the sort of the problem of talking about this book in this context. You could say that this was a book that tried to deal with left-wing politics, socialist politics, even communist politics in a post-Soviet world, which, again, has a very different, the tension between what I imagine to be a local understanding of that and a global understanding can be quite fraught, I imagine. But the purpose then, I think, of tackling those questions nonetheless is to try and Mark's trying to generate a new kind of dialogue with a younger generation that's kind of grown up in that moment. So if you're 16 in 2009, so I was born in 1991. I was born on the 26th of December 1991, the official date that the Soviet Union was dissolved. So you have that generation that's explicitly growing up, not knowing what that previous world was like. And if you don't necessarily know, I guess, how do you account for that change? I imagine maybe it's something that happens with a new generation that was maybe born after 9/11. If you were born before that time, maybe you have some sense of how that radically changed. But maybe this is also just because of where my head's at, but how you travel around the world on airplanes. But if you don't know any different, then how do you account for that kind of political change? I guess is the point to be made. And Mark's always speaking to a younger generation to try and build those bridges between that kind of generational gap. Now, Mark passed away in 2017, and I suppose my work since then has kind of been to, so Mark was teaching at Goldsmiths University of London for the last few years of his life, and I was a student at Goldsmiths when Mark passed away. And I guess this is just my project, but a lot of us who were students at that time wanted to continue that process of building bridges between different generations, between, I guess, non-activists. It's all well and good having political conversations in kind of activist meetings, but how do you then make those questions interesting or vital or essential to people that aren't that invested? How do you get them invested? They're kind of age-old problems, I suppose. But I guess the point, sorry, my mind, this is my plain brain, going slightly off track. What's been interesting to see since that time, over the last 5 years since Mark died, is that you see books like Capitalist Realism starting to be translated. It's obviously just been translated into Slovenian. Mark's work's also been translated into Japanese, Korean, Danish. Mark's always had and also Spanish. I think Mark's, he's better known now in the UK than he ever was, but there's a particularly strong following of his work in Spain and Latin America, which is kind of surprising to see. And I guess that what's interesting about that is that, again, bringing back to this question of how do you address a book that's specifically talking about UK context into other contexts, is that what's strange about Mark having a new sort of global audience is that he, in the UK, is renowned as a quintessentially British writer who writes explicitly about the weirder side of British culture. A lot of the references that he makes, if not in this book, in books like Ghost of My Life, which is the book that followed Capitalist Realism, they're sort of odd 1970s TV shows that were broadcast on the BBC that are hard to get hold of in the UK, never mind elsewhere. And so it makes that, it kind of, I guess this is kind of, again, it's another open question really, is that how, what is it about Mark's work that's now reaching these other contexts and building a kind of international solidarity? I realise I'm going way off track. Where am I at? Let me find my bearings. Yeah, well, partly what's important about that UK context, I think, at least for Mark, is not so much the political context, but how there was a cultural complicity. So, Mark's not so much, I guess that's the interesting thing of you saying that the sort of familiarity with Mark's theoretical reference points, philosophical reference points, that really elsewhere Mark's known as a cultural writer who writes about music, film. I mean, I guess that's blatantly apparent, but I think the reason why Mark was so focused on that relationship was how specifically in the 1990s and the 2000s there was this strange complicity with popular culture helping to bring about this new centrist political stasis, and how there was a disconnection between an underground avant-garde culture and popular culture. Now, I think that this is again, I guess this is something that I'm curious about how this translates into a new context when, at a time when Britain's geopolitical significance, its own sense of itself is diminishing around the world. We're now can talk about this book in a sort of post-Brexit context, things like this. But maybe there's this idea for Mark that one of what was maybe the most important export for Britain at that time, if not exporting, I guess, parliamentary democracy, was its cultural exports, and how no, that's another coffee thought gone on the way through. Sorry. The idea that maybe what Britain was exporting at that time was this idea of a cultural stasis. So, against this backdrop of the end of history, the erasure of socialist convictions from British political life, and even, I guess, globally, how by exporting its own cultural status to the world, how culture made things worse rather than better. And I guess that's partly also what this other world that Fisher grew up with. Growing up at a time where what was the pop cultural norm for him was what he called popular modernism, where you have, I guess, the example that Mark would later use in writing Acid Communism was the Beatles. Though in some senses the Beatles are a pop band, they're a boy band, they're kind of in a sort of perverted way, like a precursor to the One Directions of the world. You still have this sense that figures like John Lennon in particular were huge global pop stars that were nonetheless known for advancing a progressive political agenda. So, as well as asking where did a certain political progressivism go, Marx also asking where did this cultural ideal go along with it. Now in the 1990s you have in the UK you have this explicit war on rave culture. The sort of last bastion of this popular modernism was for Mark the jungle and drum and bass scene. And you have some pop stars that are trying to engage with that. David Bowie made a really awful album in the 90s that was trying to draw on that scene. Bjork was also involved at some point and trying to be influenced by this UK dance culture. And yet despite figures like that championing this underground, if you talk about British pop culture in the 1990s, you get this war, this chart-topping war between a band like Oasis and a band like Blur. The Blur and Oasis were fighting constantly for the #1 spot on the charts. It was kind of what defined that moment, and a lot of politicians at that time were, actively encouraging that, sort of cheering on one band or the other to get some sort of cultural favour. But those two bands, in a way, are sort of perfectly named. You have Oasis on the one hand, Oasis being, a sort of a fertile spot in a desert, that sort of I guess they're a band that embraced the illusion of prosperity that the void of new Labour centrism championed, often despite itself. And then you have Blur, a word literally meaning something that cannot be seen clearly, and being a band that spoke to a sort of disorientating lack of distinction between different political realities under capitalism at the end of the 20th century. That's not to suggest that one band stood for complicity and the other stood for critique. They were both as impotent as each other, and their rivalry didn't really have any material stakes beyond their own bank accounts, you could argue. That this was cheered on by politicians looking for some cultural credibility. The whole charade epitomised how an entire landscape of political disagreement and cultural potential had been flattened and made impotent. So whilst there was resistance to this framework, this capitalist realist framework, from that time, going back that far, I suppose, that's 20 years before the book came out, even then it was impossible to argue for alternatives from within. And the shadow of that sort of 90s moment was really long. Mark then became better known for, particularly known for his music criticism in the 2000s, writing about an artist like Burial, who arguably wouldn't be as well known if Mark hadn't been one of the first to champion him. But his, what Mark would call his kind of hauntological approach, sort of borrowing that word from Derrida, Derrida meaning that sense that the spectres of Marx that happen after that kind of fall of the Soviet Union. But But in a UK context, that's localised to the point where it's not the death of communism, but the death of rave, and they're somehow made awkwardly alike to one another. I'm going to try and tie all these different threads together now, which is that this is, as mentioned before, this idea that Marx had at the end of the world is easy to imagine at the end of capitalism, which is a line that he borrows from Frederick Jameson, but then ultimately makes his own. And the argument, succinctly put, is that our political imagination and our cultural imagination have been so misshapen by capitalist ideology that it's easier to imagine the end of life itself than it is to imagine different ways of living, or ways of living differently. Or the end of the world is the only circumstance when you can imagine that radical change happening. So post-capitalism is inherently post-apocalyptic. And whether that's due to climate catastrophe or a zombie apocalypse, the end of capitalism is only imaginable alongside the destruction of state apparatuses and the advanced management systems that organise our daily lives today. How are we doing for time? Because I'm very aware I'm rambling on a bit. Okay. This is currently reflecting the scattered, tired brain. I'm really sorry. I guess the one thing I wanted to do as well is maybe flesh out a bit more where the philosophical context for that idea comes from. So if we're talking about this capitalism, an end to or a world beyond capitalism is only imaginable with the destruction of these advanced management systems. This is an idea that we can trace back to Jean-Francois Lyotard, which is what he basically called the postmodern condition, which is again an appeal to a kind of stasis. Now, postmodernism, he argued, was the settling of modernism's frenzy. And again, we can kind of note that this is Marx's emphasis on popular modernism and bringing that back was, I guess, was explicitly another sort of term or phrase of his, like capitalist realism, that was focused on challenging this sort of new static norm. But for Lyotard, under postmodernism, there are differences. I guess one of the overarching questions was, is there still no alternative? But under postmodernism, there are differences, there are alternatives. There are always arguments for other worlds. But the problem is that these arguments in themselves are static. They're reified and fixed like chess pieces with specific characteristics and moves on a sort of fixed board. And they're caught in an infinite stalemate. So things might violently vibrate, some pieces might fall, but nothing ever really moves forwards. And this is something that I guess Alain Bourdieu argued once, that around this time, in about 2004, he sort of makes the argument that we're very capable of destroying the old at the moment. We kind of have there's a sort of cultural and political negativity. We can write off things that have failed in the past, but we're incapable of generating new things. And so when you're caught in that state, this game of I guess chess, to stick with the metaphor, is a game that doesn't end. Which means that postmodernism is not a response to a contentious present, but it's the suspension of present contentions altogether. And why it's important to bring Lyotard into this, I suppose, is that the implications of this are not just cultural and not just political, but they're broadly epistemological. So for Lyotard, in a postmodern world, any newly discovered form of knowledge or expression is immediately subordinated to a totalizing ideological truth. And this is the ultimate side effect of, for him, society's computerization. Just as any new program loaded onto a computer or a new app you put on your phone for the first time, even though it might be a new program, it has to nonetheless be rendered in a format that is legible to the operating system at large. if that's how computers work, it's also how society works, how ideology works. And that includes positions that are fundamentally opposed to a sort of status quo. And so this is, for Lyotard, the point of critique of this was the attempt to break that framework. Postmodern critique for him was what he called a war on totality, that demands we bear witness to what he also called the unpresentable, which is all that can't be rendered in the computational language of global capital. And that all sounds quite, I suppose, well, very philosophical, but for Mark, I guess the point to be made, to be emphasized, is that it's not just a computational language of global capital, it's idea, it's cultures, it's subcultures, it's outsider art, it's other forms of practice that can't be, that have to find ways through this kind of infrastructure. I wonder if this building even is kind of a good example. You have the I guess an old post office, it's part of state infrastructure in a sense, that's then made redundant and then that's taken over. That's the only sense that we can actually, that's the perfect moment where you can push through and make some sort of change. And so I guess that's Lyotard sort of making that argument in the 1980s. But the importance of what Marx doing is that he's updating that to the 21st century. Following Capitalist Realism, Marx wrote Ghost of My Life. His final book was The Weird and the Eerie. And in all of those books, he's repeatedly making that point. The Weird and the Eerie is maybe the most explicit, though he actually doesn't mention capitalism or anything in there once. It's completely cultural analysis. But for Marx, what is weird and what is eerie are precisely these sort of strange things that we often maybe see in horror films that don't belong. You can have a film like The Matrix being the most maybe cliched example, where I always think of there's that scene where Neo sees a black cat in a hallway and he sees it twice and he's like, oh, I got deja vu. And he's having he's seen something weird. And Trinity says, well, that's a sign that the system has changed somehow. I think Mark made that same, took that very literally. Things that emerge in culture now that seem weird, that seem eerie, that seem strange, that don't fit, or that maybe, or even that not even pleasurable. I guess we can enjoy horror films and things, but even displeasure, things that we find displeasurable or unpleasurable, are instances of the new that we haven't yet digested, or which just can't fit into the framework that we currently have. And that's I think, that's what Mark's arguing in this book from 2017. It's still the same argument in Capitalist Realism. As much as Mark's diagnosing a current set of conditions, the argument that he repeats, and I guess not just repeats, but actually updates every time he writes something new, is that whilst capitalism is everywhere, not everything is capitalist. Capitalism is fueled by our desires, for instance, but not everything we desire is necessarily capitalist in nature. And so it's with great difficulty that we actually excavate these things from their capitalist encasement. But in attempting to do so regardless, we demand of ourselves a new conception of the world that's not impossibly non-capitalist, but seductively post-capitalist. Which I guess is even something that Marx argues. We don't have to forsake wealth as such, or value. But we can expand our sense of what that means to include new possibilities. And once we learn to acknowledge that capitalism in its present status is not capable of providing us with those things, with the world that we desire, then the future truly returns to us. That's how stasis comes alive again, where stasis is no longer, it's I guess you just have movement. And again, this is a point that Mark always makes through cultural examples. I had another quote that was a Frederick Jameson quote that I wanted to read you, which I think summarizes Mark's entire project in a way, which is that Jameson once argued in his book on postmodernism that new political art, if it is indeed possible at all, will have to hold to the truth of postmodernism, that is to say, to its fundamental object, the world space of multinational capital, at the same time at which it achieves a breakthrough to some as yet unimaginable mode of representing, in which we may again begin to grasp our positioning as individual and collective subjects and regain a capacity to act and struggle, which is at present neutralised in our spatial sort of social confusion. Which, if you're not versed in the philosophical arguments of the 20th century, is confusing in itself, potentially. And I guess that's, again, the kind of problem that we're dealing with. If that entire world of the 20th century has this time of great upheaval, of great political challenges, has been vanquished, so that capitalism is now static, is peaceful, that we have this sense that there's almost there's a moral imperative to accept a capitalist peace because we want to be done with the conflicts of the previous century. But that's kind of that's the problem that I think why often Mark writes about cultural examples. It's very easy to talk about reigniting, as I guess as people like the Jew do, that you need a kind of new militancy. I was just mentioning that accelerationism has finally made its way to Ljubljana, and it's dividing opinion, which it does everywhere. But I guess that's partly without opening that kind of works. One of the accelerationism is a kind of mode of thought that is often polemical, often quite extreme in its thinking, kind of comes from Bourdieu, who I think very infamously argued after 9/11 that we shouldn't get rid of terrorism, for example, as a form of political action. And I think he says that knowingly, provocatively, and that in itself creates this whole debate about what remains possible after these supposedly final events where certain modes of acting are completely written off the table. And I guess to say that about terrorism is very, it speaks for itself, but I think what Mark's doing in a way is sort of saying, well, what about, if not forms of political action, even political violence, what about just these cultural forms that have suffered a sort of similar fate? Towards the end of his life, he sort of reevaluates hippie culture, and Mark always hated hippies as sort of just being like a kind of I can't remember the exact quote that he uses, but he saw the 60s counterculture as a kind of war on sensuality. It was just about, as if there was some sort of challenge to be made to society by just not washing and doing lots of drugs. And I guess that Mark was from a generation that kind of came explicitly after that, punk and post-punk being a kind of negative reaction to what came before. But then the question for Mark later in life is, well, what is it to be a hippie today? In a sense that, what can you take from that supposedly vanquished, neutralized cultural form that actually can still be radical and challenging today? And I think, though very different scales, depending on who you're talking to, you can have a very similar reaction to sort of saying, well, what use is terrorism as a political act? And I guess that part of this actually is, so I guess the point of that Jameson quote, the key bit that, and I think this is, I'm wrapping up here too, but the key point I think that it makes is that, what does it say? If any new political art has to hold to the truth of postmodernism, the world space of multinational capital, so there's no way of coming completely outside in. You have to work with what you've got. There is no outside to capitalism. There's no transcending to its outside. At this point, global capital is imminent, and it's a case of not escaping, but expanding this limited worldview. I'll skip over a bunch of what I've got far too many notes. But I guess maybe an interesting point to end on is at least that how that kind of argument, it's all well and good to say that coming from a book that's 10 years old, but to what extent is that still applicable today? I guess that capitalist realism has kind of entered like a general lexicon in the UK. People will use that phrase without having ever read the book. It's kind of that sort of well-known as a concept. But to the point that it also starts to become meaningless. But actually that there's still, we're still seeing certain political and cultural arguments that are kind of following that same framework of rigid definitions that actually don't need to be defended but need expanding. And this was kind of just the other day in the UK, there was an interview with Judith Butler in the US edition of The Guardian, she was interviewed by a woman called Jules Gleason, who's just recently edited a collection called Transgender Marxism. And she's interviewing Butler about her book Gender Trouble, and asking, that's a 30-year-old book, to what extent is the question she asking still relevant today? And I wanted to read you at least just her first response that she gives to a question asked. Gleason asks, and it's been 31 years since the release of Gender Trouble, what were you aiming to achieve in that book? And Butler says this: it was meant to be a critique of heterosexual assumptions within feminism, but it turned out to be more about gender categories. For instance, what it means to be a woman does not remain the same from decade to decade. The category of woman can and does change, and we need it to be that way. Politically, securing greater freedoms for women requires that we rethink the category of women to include new possibilities. The historical meaning of gender can change as its norms are reenacted, refused, and recreated. So we should not be surprised or opposed when the category of women expands to include trans women. And since we are also in the business of imagining alternative futures of masculinity, we should be prepared and even joyous to see what trans men are doing to the category of men. I think what's really interesting, and maybe that almost as if Butler's making a similar argument to Jameson, where Jameson says that you have to stay true to the category of the present that is multinational capital. There's no escaping that, but you can at least expand what it means. I think what Butler's doing here is challenging what we could call gender realism. The idea that gender or a certain understanding of gender from a certain time, I guess for her this is maybe the 70s and the 80s, that definition then must be rigid, and that's the one that we stick to, that's what we defend. There's questions to be asked about why we choose, why that era, why that decade, why that definition do we choose to kind of really fight for and defend? Mark's asking that question about 90s capitalism. What is it about the way that the world kind of settles into some sort of stasis after the fall of the Soviet Union that means that's the reality we always have to defend? Why can't we then, what happens to the expanding of those possibilities outwards? So whilst capitalist realism kind of becomes, at least in a UK context, this almost like overused term that is overly familiar, it kind of, it's kind of part, I guess this is kind of coming back, which feels maybe like we're an age away from where I started. But this question of what does this book mean now, here? What does it mean to translate a 10-year-old book and see what it means to a present context? I guess that what's so great about Fisher being translated at the moment, a quintessentially British writer like Fisher, being brought into these completely, not completely, but often disparate contexts, is that I think it does that work, or it starts that work, where, I mean, partly why I'm so enthused about writing on Mark's work is that, what's happened to it since his death is that it has started to expand in a really interesting way that he probably could never have done himself, as sort of being the sole custodian. When Mark died, his kind of concepts became all of us, which maybe sounds quite soft and romantic, but I think it's true. And that's true of all thinkers, I suppose, that sort of have their moment and then pass away. So yeah, if this is a question of is there still no alternative, I think the answer is that really new alternatives are emerging all the time, or rather all alternatives are continuing to expand. I think that's the key point of Butler's, which bears repeating. I think maybe is an interesting point to end on, is that politically, and I'm kind of making her comment more general, but I think maybe that shows what's kind of interesting about it, is that politically securing greater freedoms requires that we rethink categories to include new possibilities. That's what Mark did when he was alive, and I think it's what he's continuing to do beyond the grave. And hopefully there's not too much there, that we can have some sort of discussion either here now or if you'll hang around for drinks afterwards, because I'm very interested to hear those that have read it, or as this kind of, I guess, the reading group that you started continues. In what ways the Slovenian reading of this book will expand it into new areas. So on that sentiment, I'll end it there. Thank you. My brain disappeared halfway through that, but I think let's record it back. But yeah, very long day, sorry.
Sorry, I'll just bother you a bit more.
No, please. No, it's much easier to have a dialogue. It's much harder just talking at people and expecting everyone to follow along. So yeah, hopefully we can unpack some.
So I guess I'll start with some questions, and then I hope there are some questions or comments in the audience. So I was thinking when you were talking about Mark Fisher and culture as a cultural writer, when I was reading Mark Fisher, I was always kind of, I put it like that. When he talks about politics, I don't buy him quite, because he has these, I don't know, usual classical categories like class, like I don't know, working class and class consciousness, which are okay, which are some basic Marxist notions, which I think can be still productive. Why not? But I don't buy when he's talking about that. I buy him when he talks about culture. He talks about, I know, burial, you mentioned, or hippies,
yeah.
also, or for example, caretaker. But my question would be, what is the object of Mark Fisher, of his criticism? Because I don't know if we can connect the political aspect and cultural aspects. For example, when he talks about caretaker, for example, he talks about social amnesia or something like that, how he put it in sound. And this, I think, has nothing to do with politics at, I don't know, a direct level, but I think what he manages, and he does it really well, he shows a general state of mind that we are all in. Like capitalist realism, it is in our heads, how to put it, like you mentioned, ideology. And I think he's really sharp-minded, but when he talks about politics, I don't see that he is convinced in politics as well. Because also, you know, when you talked about his political stance or something like that, okay, he's a leftist or something, but he's accelerationist. I guess he has some here ambiguity, at least in his political stance. So,
yeah, I mean, yeah, it's the kind of moments of accelerationism is, I think for Mark it means something very particular. But I guess, I mean, I think that's kind of what I struggled with in trying to put this together, actually, because I think that you're right. But if there's not a clear relationship between Marx's politics and his cultural writing, or even like a sort of, I think he's trying to build those bridges. And I think that's partly what I mean when talking about Mark as a quintessentially British writer. I don't think those limitations of his political thinking are his alone. They're just like terminally Anglo. Like that's just, his limitations I think are all of us, like in terms of Britain. Britain's own political thinking is very much stuck on those, at least popular, in terms of popular culture, is stuck on those very fixed ideas that maybe, aren't really, they're so rigid that he doesn't seem to be able to get past them. But I think culture is his way of doing so. That culture, what he can't do with politics does through culture, I think is partly the point. But it is a very difficult thing, I think, that, he always struggled to bridge that gap. I think that's why, in a lot of ways, The Weird and the Eerie, his final book is maybe one of, I think it's my favourite book of his, because he doesn't talk about politics at all. But actually, it's kind of in that the same way. I think it's actually also his most political, and that's not true, but the political stakes of the book are actually clearer when he's not mentioning it, if that makes sense. There's a sort of osmosis there that, as if he realises his own strengths in that regard. And the politics comes through just from talking about the culture, without him having to, weigh it down in certain kinds of terminology.
Yeah, because I was thinking when you were talking about desire, you have, I think you've written in forward to Post-Capitalist Desire, that he tried somehow to revive counterculture and hippies, and with all acid communism and that. So I was wondering if desire is something that today we can primarily found in, I don't know, cultural products or something like that, and not in politics, because we have, I don't know, this leftist melancholy, and we have this, I don't know, you have to be on the good side of the politics, whatever that is. But when it comes to culture, like music, for example, I think it's kind of easier to feel your own desire or express your own desire, and I think that Mark Fisher kind of knew this when he wrote about, I don't know, different cultural aspects. Like when he criticized certain, I don't know, movies like Children of Men or something like that. I think it's okay. I'm convinced, but it's not something that you say, okay, yes, it's a good critique. But when he speaks about, I don't know, Death of Ray, for example, and I can relate to that, despite he being embedded in Manchester, for example, right?
Yeah.
Because we have this universality, if I may put it philosophically, from that particularity of his situation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's part of that same problem where, I guess maybe taking the hippie example, if less so hippies, Mark was interested in psychedelia. And what I find really interesting about him dealing with that is that, well, again, it's another way of kind of updating what maybe has become a sort of explicitly Marxist truism. Like Marx's line that I won't remember the specific wording, but something like that philosophers have always thought that they had to interpret the world and put it to change it. And I think that whilst that sounds nice, and I guess maybe is a sentiment that's very familiar at this point after being sort of over 2 centuries old, but Mark finds that kind of kernel in psychedelia, like literally and it's kind of something that I tried to unpack in the foreword to Mark's final lectures, where psychedelia literally means taking its sort of etymological root to make manifest what is in the mind. And you can think of that as being like a hallucination, which fits into his writing on The Weird and the Eerie. But I think he's kind of skipped over talking a bit about the CCIU and Mark's stuff at the University of Warwick. But I think the one line that they always had in their kind of, I guess the short introduction to what the CCIU is, it stands for the Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, which is where Mark sort of started a lot of his work, was that they believed that theory wasn't something to be applied to culture. Culture was already theoretical, and you could kind of draw it out. And I feel like that's kind of something that Mark always stuck with. So looking at what is it to look at the counterculture, look at psychedelia as being, what is it to draw that comparison between Marx and psychedelia? What is it to say that Marx is psychedelic? And I think that's the kind of provocation that Mark was best at. I think maybe that's where, I guess that's something that you have with the example of the caretaker. That caretaker's sort of that project is so, especially towards the end, I guess his final project being about dementia, which I guess there was also a thing with like viral on TikTok for like teenagers trying to like it was because of that. I think the last project he did was the end of, I can't remember, it's a long title, but it's like a 6-hour project where he starts with his sort of loops of like ballroom dancing tracks, this sort of usual style, but over the 6 hours of this project, the whole thing starts to disintegrate. And then there was this weird TikTok trend where teenagers were like challenging each other to listen to the 6 hours in its entirety, and like just absorb it and see if they could withstand it as if it was an endurance thing, which is two worlds colliding that you would never. There's plenty of things where we think about what would Marx say about this, and that's probably, I think, the most significant one that I wish there was like a cave book about. But I think, like, you know, but it's a good question, like, what is it that is that teenagers on TikTok are getting out of a project like that, that's, you know, about these deep questions of like the dissolution of subjectivity? How is, when you turn that into an endurance challenge on TikTok, is that facetious, or is that potentially, you know, the seed of something that might bear fruit later on that has, you know, very explicit political implications?
Yeah.
Which, I mean, you know, it remains to be seen, but
it helps if it takes them to listen. I might use TikTok, I guess. Yeah, but what is about hippies that Marka Fisher actually saw in them, or in that psychedelia moment? Because he was in some moment, I think, interested in the 70s and Joy Division and melancholy and everything connected with this. And we mentioned the ontology and everything. Yeah, but why hippies? Why 60s? Because 70s are really depressing from the standpoint of Marka Fisher, but why did he turn to counterculture in the 60s?
I think that's like one of the unanswered questions in a way. It remains, so that only came to light because the Acid Communism essay that I think was later published in this giant K-punk anthology that was put out after Mark died, of his blog post. The Acid Communism essay was unpublished, it was a draft that had been circulated amongst some friends. That was going to be the introduction to his next book. And no one knew what he was writing about until that came out. So that is it. I think that's the first question that people had after Mark had died. But in a way, it does sort of fit, because I think he was always about sort of confounding expectations. In a way that's like, so I guess what his interest in the 70s and the 80s, specifically post-punk, I don't know whether that's, I mean, I think Mark did think it was the best thing in the world, but it's also because that was when he grew up. Like those were his teenage years. Like, it wasn't just that Joy Division was his kind of a timeless cool, but it was cool for him as a teenager. You know, like that's his moment. But I guess that what that entire moment was about was precisely confounding those expectations. What happens after punk, where I guess that punk being this huge sort of aggressive negativity after the counterculture, after hippies, as if to, you know, completely reject all of that. But post-punk is then to sort of to explore the possibilities that negation made possible, that ultimate refusal kind of, you know, it tore up the rule book, and post-punk is kind of writing that rule book anew without necessarily being precious about, I guess it's this kind of this end of history thing too, right? Like the Jews line is something like historicity, not history. One of the interesting things of like saying that, like calling the moment we're in late capitalism, or trying to, you know, concretely define what the culture of the 2000s was or the 2010s was, is kind of, I think, on the one hand, like a regretful instinct that we want to order everything, you know, turn things into genres, so that they're, you know, that makes them you could say previous to that made things more easily marketable. We only have music genres because that's how people needed to organise music in record shops. Like it's a marketing ploy essentially. So there's this fear that if we define certain eras, we're making them, we're serving them up to capitalism. But the counterpoint to that is that actually when you define eras in that way, you give them an ending, and then you're immediately faced with the question of what's next. And I think for Mark that the end of history kind of didn't do that. It was sort of saying an end to categories altogether, but actually there was something to be said for saying that the 90s happened and then it ended. The 2000s happened and then they ended. And it's, I guess, always trying to see what, not only can you move on, but then you actually get into a place where you can reevaluate. And I feel like maybe for Mark, there was for him personally, as kind of just an older guy, and even maybe just the fact that his sort of friendship group was changing. I know that he was sort of working with people like Jeremy Gilbert was a friend of Mark's who runs a radio show in the UK that's sort of all about that sort of like disco and stuff that I think maybe Mark did like disco, but the sort of stuff that is very antithetical, you would assume, to his sort of post-punk era. But yeah, being able to reevaluate those things I think is a really important process for him, for kind of all those reasons. But I guess it's making those things alive again. It's making them being up for debate. Is precisely how new things emerge. And new things emerge when we reconsider what's just happened, I guess. And we've kind of not done that for a while. I find it really interesting now that people are talking about the two. Maybe it does just take a decade or two, but I never thought we'd get to a point where sort of say 2000s fashion trends would come back and would be named. That did sort of seem like something that wouldn't happen for a long time. And there's questions to be asked about what it means that we're actually in that moment now. We're at a moment where we can recognise that this era has ended, because then, precisely means what comes next.
Yeah, but hippies obviously ended.
Yes.
Quite quickly. And is it the case then that hippies can be, I don't know, if we reevaluate the countercultures from the 60s, can it be, I don't know, the hippie desire can save the problem of end of history? I'm kidding a bit.
Well, I mean, I guess that maybe even to kind of better answer your previous question in a way, it's like the, I guess what's key to that whole moment for Mark is drugs. Despite naming something Acid Communism, Mark wasn't big into psychedelics, so he wasn't into drugs in the sense that though we kind of hold acid up as or any kind of drug, I suppose. I think Mark used to make the example of MDMA, that to what extent is we start that again. We romanticize drugs as being mind expanding, right? It's sort of saying that you take acid and you see the world differently and expands your horizons, but I feel like for Mark, he didn't trust that. He just saw it as a kind of escapism. I think he makes the point about MDMA where he says that taking any kind of drug, it's that question, Lyotard's question about computerization. Until you rewrite the operating system underneath, we can do Google Deep Dream now, whatever. You can make your computer hallucinate, but we're still running on Microsoft. And I think Mark was I think he sort of saw drugs as that kind of thing. It's getting really excited about Google Deep Dream, whilst at the same time, that same sort of, the global arm of Google is kind of responsible for, it's far more terrifying than it's exciting. And I think Mark would say when it came to drugs that we should only think about this deep dream stuff after we've dealt with the operating system underneath. You have to, he talked about the ego as the human operating system. That's something that Cisse, you would talk about. The human operating system, it's not just about hacking it or, I don't know, using weird 90s cyberpunk metaphors, but, to what extent, another way of putting it maybe is if the end of the world is easy to imagine the end of capitalism, that's the outward look. turning that question inwards. You know, what is it to imagine human society beyond individualism, beyond ego? How do you, I think it's my favourite line in here actually, to show my nerd chops. I know it was another page number, I don't often know the page number for things in books. What does he say? It's my favourite line in the whole book, so I want, the required, so I guess another part of it maybe is that one of the key questions even for now, this idea that we have around the climate catastrophe, that it's a case of, for a long time it's been what can individuals do? And you kind of have this meme online now that, I remember seeing it when New York was flooded, like very recently, and sort of saying, well, this is clear evidence that this situation that we're in is getting worse. And people would sort of quote these videos of extreme weather conditions and say, but I stopped using plastic straws. Like, why is this still happening? I did my bit, why isn't it working with that? And it's Marx kind of responding to that idea already here in 2009, and he says the required subject, a collective subject, does not exist, yet the crisis, like all of the global crises we're now facing, demands it be constructed. And I think that's even a really radical idea that kind of shows the shadow of the counterculture of hippie, of this kind of new way of thinking about how to organise society collectively, challenging structures like the family, like the state, you know, at every level, and having a sort of new kind of collective, you know, a way of thinking about ourselves beyond I, beyond me, beyond you, but actually thinking of ourselves in a way that's collective, that then isn't just reduced to nationality or class or skin colour or gender. Like, to what extent can we have a sense of ourselves as a collective that isn't defined by those, you know, essentially sort of liberal identity categories? How do you expand those categories to be truly collective rather than just demographics for, you know, neoliberal management systems, or, well, advanced management systems, what Leontine calls it. The idea that society is just set up to deal with us as numbers, or as, you know, as collectives, that the very idea of being collective is kind of reduced and made completely impotent and meaningless. It's just something used to organise us rather than that we used to organise ourselves.
Okay. Does anyone from the audience maybe have a question or a comment or something? Can you just say it aloud, please?
Question.
Oh, yeah.
Maybe it's not a good question, but you mentioned, I don't know, Marka Fisherja, but you were mentioning the death of communism, the death of brave, then all kinds of death. Does Fisher have any particular stance about what it means to die, or what is the end or something? For instance, does the communism end when the Soviet Union ends, or does it end 10 years earlier when communism has nothing new to be anymore?
I guess that's, I suppose in a way that's the thing that's really being challenged, that we talk about things that die. But I suppose that a lot of what Mark, in his sort of properly Gothic mode, often writes about is, so like Derrida's thing is the spectre of Marx. Communism is dead, but the spectre lives on. We're still haunted by the idea of it. I think that's, Marx sort of saw that everywhere. Rave culture is essentially legislated out of existence, that you can't hold raves anymore in the UK in the way that it once was, but we still will try and the fact that we will go to, we will do what we can to organise a party in a space under a certain set of rules, sort of shows that we're still haunted by that idea of that kind of free-for-all coming together. So I think, in a way, I think maybe that it's maybe Marx introducing. He's trying to make us, ask that question. He might not have an answer for himself, but sorry.
That's good. Maybe I can just put it differently. Like, is the end the consequence of something outside that just like put things to an end, or can it be thought the Marxism as a consequence of the thing itself that has to die eventually? Like if it comes to its own end, or it's just ended because, I don't know, police made prohibition of war race and that's the end.
Right. I guess maybe I'm going to ask your question back to you.
Maybe that's not even a question for Matt Fisher, I don't know.
Well, no, but I think it's if not. I think it's a question that he was asking. I guess it's maybe saying that it's even like a fashion thing, like that we sort of say something is over. That maybe we announce the death of things prematurely, and I guess maybe the question is, why do we do that? What's the ideological significance of saying that communism is dead, to use that example, when the Soviet Union dies? Why are those two, what's the, I mean, it kind of answers itself, right? There's an ideological reason for making those two things equivalent. As if to say that, if you announce something's dead, then it will die quicker or something. Like, I think that's the kind of slippery territory that he wanted to, question and kind of, poke his finger into.
Can I just add something? Because we had this question about the spectrality of communism. We've just discussed about this last night, so I just wanted to, just briefly go back to that in the group of the reading group on Mark Fisher. Basically, I think the answer is very simple. Mark Fisher doesn't really declare the death or the end of communism or Marxism or alternatives. He simply acknowledges that it's an accepted fact. He's basically describing what Margaret Thatcher did in the 1980s, and it's not intra-British what she did. I mean, it's not essentially British to say that there is no alternative. It's not essentially British to say there's no such thing as society. It was something that kind of coincided with the death of the Soviet Union, the death of a certain kind of communist project. And I think it was something that so globally changed the way people looked at things that, yes, I mean, idiotic books like Francis Fukuyama's The End of History were possible. And there does work on Spectres of Marx is a kind of an answer to that already. So it's not that whether you want to have communism dead or not, the fact is that it has been accepted as a fact. And I think, if I may just add something more, and I hope I'll not take too long, but I just wanted to add something as to the potential relevance of Mark Fisher's work today, because you've been constantly asking us, why did you translate this? How is this book relevant 10 years later?
I mean, I'm not surprised, but I asked that question genuinely. I'm really interested to know.
Okay, so I'm personally a philosopher, so I don't, for me, 10 years is like nothing. I see Plato's work as absolutely relevant for today. So I suppose I'm the wrong person to actually say anything on this topic. But the way I understand Fisher's point, especially in this book, in Capitalist Realism, the point is that there's even a change from the position of Margaret Thatcher in the 80s, when she simply declares that there is no alternative, where she declares that there is no such thing as society, and then looking at the 21st century, where this is not simply one politician's declaration, but it is something that is tacitly accepted by the entire civilization, in a sense, by the entire civilization dominated by global capitalism. So in that sense, I see that if times have changed since Mark Fisher wrote this book, they have only evolved further into the same direction. So, Corona crisis has only underscored how little actually there is of a society, if you want. How little, it has only increased social hierarchies and differences, not decreased them. So we've only been evolving further along.
Middle class.
Sorry?
But we are all middle class.
Okay.
I'm joking.
Okay, okay. So, yeah, okay, that's, I suppose, my comment. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think you put it far better than I did. Sorry, I appreciate that. No, I agree with you. Yeah, that's great.
All right, thanks. Sorry, I'll shut up.
Anyone else?
I guess I'm the senior citizen, so I can keep talking. I mean, I don't have a problem asking more questions or you know, having more comments. So another thing that I wanted to just briefly touch on is what I mean. The question of quintessentially Britishness of Fisher's work, and I understand what you mean. I mean, his cultural references are indeed extremely local. Like, who knows this? I mean, like you've said, I mean, even within the UK, it's hard to actually, you know, find those references that he's talking about. But when you look at the cultural critics that he uses, you know, the references that he makes to, he's quoting Frederick Jameson, he's quoting Slavoj Žižek, he's quoting Lyotard. He's basically quoting well-established, like the canon almost, if you want, of contemporary cultural critique. So in some sense, yes, his specific cultural examples are local, super local maybe to UK. Not all of them, of course, but some of them are maybe really extremely local. But his approach, his methodology is not like specifically UK. It's very well established canon, I'd say.
Yeah, no, I think maybe the point I'm trying to make, rather than, I definitely don't want to sort of drive a hard distinction between local and global. But I think maybe, I guess it's the, I guess what I mean by that is I'm interested in how, in a way, but that's like yeah, that's the British understanding to a fault. Not to say that, because I agree with you, but then the way that Marx sort of, I think that if to say to anybody to say that this book has been translated in all these different languages, I think many people in the UK would be like, why? But you know, but that's not to say that I agree with that. I think that it shouldn't be. But I think that that's precisely maybe the strength of Marx's projects. Like that's kind of, we were talking about it in the car on the way over, the strange irony that, yeah, though Marx is using this canon, he's referring to it, I think he specifically wrote the book for people that have no idea. And I guess it's that he's purposefully trying to build those bridges. That maybe I think, and this I guess what I mean is that it speaks to the island mentality of the UK, that is what the UK assumes. But that what I think is like this is that's precisely what Marx wants to challenge. But it may be, I think, to say that that's kind of what capitalism wants people to think about. It wants to have this. What Marx is going for is this is a phrase that my friend Natasha Eves came up with, that I think she came up with anyway, that I always love and I always bring out, is that Marx was always trying to establish solidarity without similarity. So I guess that we can say that absolutely there is a project here that is recognisable to everybody living within global capitalism. But I think then what becomes interesting with this sort of stuff being translated is actually focusing on those local issues and sort of connecting those things up, having, you know, re-establishing that link between the local and the global, seeing what comes from not taking those connections for granted. And that's precisely how those concepts expand, and that's something to be celebrated. And that, yeah, it's sad that Mark didn't kind of live to see that. I think when he was alive, I think the biggest international fan base has always been in Germany. And I don't think he was that widely translated beyond that after his death. But, you know, I guess it's in a way it's an open question in my mind. You know, what is it? Does that say something about now? Does it say something that, not asking with incredulity why this book and why now, But because I'm quite genuinely fascinated about what that says about how the world's changed in a way. And yeah, just kind of about, I guess, expanding that to not just be that. And maybe it ties into that whole notion of the end of the world as easy to imagine in capitalism. That in these local contexts, rather, there are more specific alternatives. But I guess when you focus on the local and multiply those local examples together, then you have then you have a swarming of alternatives that can be just as applicable to elsewhere. Because I guess that's what I mean, is that whilst there is a UK understanding of this book that's fatally British and blinkered for that reason, that it's the kind of it's the reception this book always deserved. But yeah, how will that change the project? I guess that's. I'm excited about it. Yeah, I don't mean to sound I'm completely surprised, but I think it's what's so exciting about Mark's work now. I mean, just personally, like working with Mark's work, to hear that it's kind of the strange. Maybe this is just my own self-consciousness, but I'm very aware that I wouldn't want to just come and sort of talk about. It's having the dialogue. I wouldn't want to come and just explain and introduce this book stuck in that kind of same context. I feel like I know a lot of Marx's cultural references. I'd be curious to know what cultural examples or there are from Slovenia that maybe express similar sentiments in a different way, and how that adds to this tapestry that ultimately helps to challenge that sense of realism. That there is that there is a multitude of alternatives everywhere. But by putting those alternatives into dialogue, it kind of only strengthens them for everybody else.
So yeah, I think we can end it here with the dialogue. So thank you for coming. I hope you stay here and you'll continue outside, I guess. So thank you, Matt.